I'm so thrilled to be joined by Simran Jeet Singh, who is an incredible human being and a scholar and an activist, and most importantly, the author of this incredible book, The Light We Give, which is a national bestseller with absolute cause. It's brilliant and beautiful, and you should absolutely go out and buy it. But I'm so glad that he's joining me here for this conversation, and I'm really happy that his words are on the top of my book. So, rubbing elbows with greatness.
Yes,
Thank you,
yeah,
Simran.
of course. No, you're sending the wrong message though. This is your day, and it's about your book. So yeah, I'm super excited to talk about it. Before we even get there, I have my copy with me. Oop, we're on blur, so you can't totally see it. But Onion, your choice?
No, it was actually the publisher's choice.
Yeah.
And I was so anticipating them coming back with a cover design that was going to be like soft and had, watercolors and like tears or something in a blue tone. And then they sent me this cover and it was this bright pink onion.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
was like instantly enchanted.
It's amazing. It's
And it really
perfect.
fits the tone of the book because the book is not, a really somber or morose book, even though it, touches on some really heavy topics and serious topics. And I, wanted to give crying the kind of serious treatment it deserves. But also, if you're writing a book on crying, you run the danger of making it kind of a bummer if you, don't have some levity in there and don't have some warmth and humor. And I tried to really, walk that line in the writing of it. And so I really love that it's going out into the world's rest in a little bit of whimsy, which also, just my own personal style. I was like, this feels like me. So I was really
Yeah,
happy when I saw it.
it is. I mean, it really fits you, and it fits the tone and tenor of the book. Is it determining your outfit choices for launch week? Are you trying to cover?
No, and so it's a funny. I actually did the opposite with my outfit choices. Well, I have like a little bit right now. I did a little custom manicure, and you can't really see, but I have some little teardrops on me. So little nail art that sort of nods at the pink of the cover. But actually, my launch outfit tomorrow, for folks who are going to join me in New York is I don't want to ruin it too much, but it has some nods to sort of some tearful elements. I got these very cool shoes that um, they're crocodile skin, but they're blue. It's a whole wild thing. So that'll be more the literal. I will dress in the literal reference of tears and let my book do the symbolism.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so tell us. I want to talk about the process of writing the book. I want to talk about some of the substance, but tell us a little bit. This is the big day that you've been building up to for ever. It sounds like since childhood, in a
Yes.
way, the dream moment. So tell what's it been like? How's it feeling? What are the highlights so far?
Yeah, I mean, it really has been since childhood. I mean, I remember learning that you could write books because I was always a big reader from the time I was a little kid. And then I remember learning that the way that books got in the world was that other people got to write them for a job, which felt like, when you learn that people like work in a candy factory or something, it was like this, oh my God, I could do that. And it just lit this spark of hope and joy that, maybe one day I would be able to write my own. And then, all the way through my teen years and my young adulthood, I would go and wander bookstores and just sort of dream and imagine about what it would look like to, have my book be among them. And so it feels in some ways like this moment I've been waiting for a very long time. And then in other ways, it still feels totally surreal. A little shout out. I know one of the people in the room is Kathy Greenwood, who's my middle school English teacher. And she always did this thing where she would have kids like go public, and she would really encourage you to send your writing out to like Teen Ink and these other teen magazines to try to, get published. And that was the first time I ever, got published in a forum beyond my parents' kitchen wall. And it really like lit a fire when you are affirmed that the words you say are going to mean something to somebody. It really creates this spark of imagination that never left me. I mean, the old adage is that like words create worlds, but that's true for, outside of the world, the world outside, but it's also true for you. Like, the process of writing spurs my own imagination, and it helps me learn what I think. It helps me, learn what I'm feeling. And I think definitely like the process of writing this book was also a, process of uncovering some of that for myself. And so to actually see it in a store and be able to pick it up and hold it off a shelf feels like this incredible apotheosis of all these things that have been cooking for a very long time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about the process of writing. I mean, I want to get into the mechanics of it, but also it sounds like there were some elements um, that you uncovered about yourself that I mean, just by what you just said here. And I found this to be true in writing my own book. Were you surprised at moments about things that you were uncovering about yourself when you were writing?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely partly was just me going back and uncovering some things I hadn't thought about a lot for a while. You know, it's like some of the internalized homophobia I had as a kid, and the things that I was struggling with that are painful and tender places to touch. And I wanted to be honest and real, because that's about something like how I lost my tears, how I stopped crying. I didn't want to do that a disservice by sugarcoating it or by being dishonest or glossing over like the really serious harm that a lot of kids experience when we're growing up. And I was really, really fortunate that I didn't endure all kinds of other harm that so many uh, queer kids in particular, but also just children experience. But I also I really wanted to dive into those painful places that explain why I lost the ability to cry, because I didn't think I could really tell that story effectively unless I did that. So that was definitely part of it. But I also think I just learned a lot about crying writing this book. One of the things that I did, when you read the book, uh, is I interviewed all these people. I wanted to make sure that, because crying is such a particular act and so different for every different person, I wanted to make sure that my book was carrying all kinds of stories that I don't, carry in my own body. And so I did all these interviews with everybody from, huge theologians to actors to TikTok stars to teachers to, kids who grew up on cattle ranches, like all sorts of different people who I was able to find and get to talk to me about crying for an hour. Um, and in the process of doing those interviews, it really changed the way that I understand crying. I think when I was setting out to write the book, I had this image of crying as a destination, as this place that we reach sort of emotionally, that it's the sum total of all these experiences that precede the crying act. And as I talked to people and I heard about the way that crying functioned in their own lives, that these moments where they remember where they had intense bouts of weeping that changed them, I really started to drift towards this process oriented approach to crying, where I understand crying as something that is inextricably connected to all of the moments that precede it and also the change that happens afterwards. And so I think that was a big change as I was writing. It was just my own internal understanding of crying going from, something that I think was a little simplistic to really getting a much more nuanced and rich understanding of, how it works in our bodies and how it works interpersonally.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And yeah, one of the more I don't know if you mean this to be provocative. I wonder if you might reflect on it, but one of the more provocative stories you share at the beginning of the book and experiences has to do with your own process of learning not to cry.
Yeah.
Um, and the reason that I found it provocative was like I found it so resonant with my own experiences um, of ways that I was socialized that I haven't really thought about. And so it made me wonder um, why am I the way that I am? Not just with crying, but in how I express emotion or don't express emotion.
Yeah.
More the latter than the former. So yeah, I'd love for you to share a little bit about this experience for you. What was it like for you, as you sort of share at the beginning of the book? What was it like for you to learn not to cry, and how did you unlearn that over time?
Yeah. I mean, so crying is almost the opposite of a canary in the coal mine. By the time we stop crying, so much emotional damage has already happened. Very often, like losing your tears is not the first thing that happens. It's you've already traveled so far down this road towards emotional numbness by the time you lose the ability to cry. Um, Bell Hooks has this really phenomenal quote in her book on masculinity called The Will to Change, where she says the first act of violence that patriarchy demands of men is not violence against women, but to kill off the emotional parts of the self.
Mm.
And that, for me, rings incredibly true. I remember everything from, watching kids at school, particularly boys who cried, be mercilessly mocked. And at a young age, making a very clear, cogent, oh, connection. Oh, that's what happens. That's what happens if you're vulnerable. And particularly as a kid who was not tremendously socially graceful and was not wasn't doing super great in the socialization to begin with. I was very, very finely attuned to anything in my social surroundings that was going to invite harm. And unfortunately, uh, particularly when I was growing up, but I think still, we have all these systems that we grow up in that treat vulnerability and tenderness with aggression.
Mm.
Because that's the thing. I have these memories of these 6-7 year olds brutally making fun of a classmate for crying, and like that's awful, but it's also not them. No 6-year-old who's bullying somebody else for crying is doing that because there's some hardwired instinctive part of them that wants to lash out and bully a peer. It's those they're enacting systems that they have been modeled. They learned that behavior somewhere. And so I think kids are way more perceptive than we often give them credit for. And so I definitely remember having these experiences where I would watch things happening in the world and I would make the connection and say, okay, well, it's actually not safe to cry around other people. And what's interesting is I didn't stop crying right away. I just stopped crying around others.
Interesting.
I started just, sequestering crying into the recesses of my life. Something would happen in the moment and I would feel like I wanted to cry and I would tamp it down. And then, maybe later when I got home or if I, could get to a moment by myself, then I would cry. But what that does is it creates a distance between the experience of an emotion and actually releasing the emotion.
Mm.
And if you do that enough, it becomes habitual and instinctive. And then before long, all of a sudden, you're just not experiencing that emotion in the same deep way that you used to.
Mm.
And so, yeah, by the time I was, maybe in 7th grade, I don't remember crying at all. I mean, really, after 9/11 is about one of the last times I really remember like seriously crying. And then nothing. And what I got instead was just this emotional numbness to the point where by the time I was in college, I had emotions. I could be like, oh yes, I am happy, or oh, I am sad. I could name them, like kind of like an emotion chart for kindergartners. I can be like, that's the smiley face. I had emotions, but I didn't feel any of them particularly deeply. They were all close to this baseline of, just being. And that was very much a protective shell I had built around myself. And when I got to seminary, I had a professor who invited us to share. This is like my first semester there. And so I'm, 21 years old. And I had this professor who invited us to share a memory crying. And I listened to all of my classmates go around and share these beautiful moments where they talked about grieving a loved one or ending a relationship or something in the world that just cut them so deeply that their empathy just spilled over. And listening to all these folks describing this rich humanity cast my own emotional deadness in stark relief. And so I really remember, I don't even remember what I said because I didn't have one. I probably just made something up. I think I was ashamed, honestly. I was just like, yeah, I cried about, but then I went home that night and I was like, oh my God, like something is broken in me. And that's
Mm,
the other side of this shame is like so many of us grow up with all of this shame around crying. And then all of a sudden we become adults. And now we have all of this shame in the other direction because we wish we were more emotionally available. We wish we were able to feel deeply. And we didn't ask to to lose that full spectrum of our humanity. We didn't ask to have our emotions be deadened. But now we find ourselves in a place that we simultaneously feel like we're wrongly embodied. I mean, that's like the thing about crying when you're, telling a child who's crying not to cry, you're basically telling them that they're in their body wrong. Like crying is this natural response that we have to a whole host of things. It's a way to forge connection between people. It's a way for the body to process, grief, suffering, pain, joy. And it's a very, very natural and instinctive behavior. And so when you tell somebody don't cry, you're telling them that their body is wrong. And then, fast forward a whole bunch of years, and all of a sudden you find yourself in a body that again feels wrong.
yeah,
And that's just such palpable grief.
yeah, yeah. I'm thinking about my kids, and my wife and I have actually had conversations about, well, how do we navigate this exact question, that we want them to feel what they feel. We don't want to force them to separate out, um, or even to try and regulate um, their tears, and also we want to teach them how to be socially appropriate, because I mean, what else happens, right? They get made fun of and they're
Yep.
called crybaby, and that's its own thing. And so it's a really vexing question of like, how do we do this? And I love how you explored in the book. I was thinking about what I wanted to share, and I'm going to ask you to read for us a little bit too, if you'd be open to it.
I would love
Uh,
to.
but I pulled a little passage, um, that really pretty early in the book, did what any good professor would want a good student to do, which is, can you tell me the stakes? Like, what are we missing out on when we're not crying? And I think you did that so beautifully, in the first chapter, Learning to Cry. You say, crying brings clarity, for through our tears we see what truly matters, our connection to one another, the deep mutuality that is both our birthright and responsibility. A culture that mourns better can help to build a world where no one is forced to mourn needlessly. But our lacrimation doesn't just help us communicate, it whispers secrets about ourselves, our fervent hopes and aching longing. Reclaiming our right to cry not only cares for our own bodies, it helps us prophetically reimagine culture. This duality is what makes crying so powerful, and it's why pernicious social forces try so hard to stop it. You go on to talk about, what it does for our body and our environment and so on. And I mean, I just love to hear you reflect for a moment on that passage, right? You're basically here setting up your claim for what is important about this book and what is this message you want to share. And I just would love to hear from you. Why is it that this message, I mean, there are so many things you could have written about,
Yeah.
but what is it about this message that just feels like it's the one that you wanted to share with the world right now?
Yeah, I mean, crying is revelatory, and that's what makes it powerful, and it's what makes it scary. And that's true on a personal level, and it's true on a social level. I think part of why I repressed my tears also is because I was afraid of admitting all of the parts of myself to myself.
Mm,
Um, I because crying is so effeminized, in the way that we treat it culturally and linked to homosexuality in men. I would watch people who cry, kids who cried, be called gay, and I was very much not willing to confront my own, bisexuality, pansexuality, whatever you want to call it.
mm, yeah.
And I was, as much as I wasn't willing to let other people know about it and was not ready to, come out to the world, I also really was not ready to come out to myself. And that is something that crying threatened. Crying threatened to expose to me who I was, parts of who I was that I was not ready to face. And so it was easier to suppress those tears. It was easier to get rid of them than it was to actually confront all of who I was. And so that's a personal dimension that functions on. But we see that socially writ large, the way that again and again and again, our country would rather subjugate and suppress grief than deal with the causes that are making people grieve. What is a Black Lives Matter protest if not a communal expression of overwhelming anguish? This proclamation that this person we love should still be with us and they're not. And how does this country respond? Tanks and tear gas. I mean, that's that same, suppressing of tears taken to a militarized extreme.
Mm.
And it's because if we actually dealt with the grief, if we confronted the grief, if we were really honest in the incredible suffering that political systems wreak in our country every single day, we would have to change them. It's very uncomfortable to confront somebody else's suffering and say like, well, that sucks. Like that naturally causes personal discomfort because you're human. And we were actually, created to be connected to one another. We were created with all kinds of physiological systems that are hardwired for empathy. That's one of the things that we see, all throughout the crying research is when somebody else is crying, on average, most people feel compassion. That's, I think, one of the beautiful things that I found in the crying research was again and again, they would do these studies where they would show people, with regular faces, and then they would digitally add tears. And if they digitally added tears, people felt like they wanted to help that person.
Mm.
And so if you were, somebody who does not want the culture to change, you have two choices. Either you can, do what you don't want to do and change the culture, or you can remove the stimulus that is causing people to feel sympathy and solidarity. And that is again and again what this country chooses to do.
Yeah. Well, I love that. I'm looking at the comments here and see what Lee said about this conversation. Speaking as someone who's always labeled a crybaby, I hope you can see the comment, but
yeah,
very, very resonant with what you were sharing earlier. I wonder if I know I foreshadowed this earlier, but would you do a little reading for us? I know it can be awkward. Maybe you have a passage already picked out or a favorite.
I would love to do a little reading. This is actually a part of the first chapter as well. So I start the first chapter talking about some experiences of sort of cultural grief that I witnessed. And then I say that was a story about grief that I witnessed, but it's easier to talk about other people's tears than it is to sit amid our own. To hide behind others crying without being honest about ours betrays the vulnerability tears demand and deserve. And it's simpler to tell you about the time I wept as a spiritual experiment, because that story still places me firmly in control. To hide behind one's past can be a bypass all its own. So I'll be honest. On December 5th, 2020, I began a season of weeping that's still ongoing as I watched the church I love and serve burn to the ground. By the time I woke that Saturday morning, I had already missed a couple dozen calls, texts, and voicemails. I opened one from my boss, the Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis. Her voice was anguished and clipped. "Ben, the church is on fire. Call me when you get this." At first, those words sounded absurd, like she had called to say, "Ben, my giraffe has got loose," or "Ben, this orange has typhus." That's the thing about churches. Their majesty belies their frailty. Imposing stone walls and breathtaking wood inlay suggest they'll live forever, safely outside the ravages of tragedy and time. So when the words, "the church is on fire," finally sank in, my next thought was, oh, there's a small fire in the parish hall. So I quickly Googled middle church fire and promptly sat down on my bedroom floor, because what I saw instead was an inferno. Flames exploded through the windows and licked the roof like locusts. The blaze was so intense it lit up the night into an incandescent dawn. As I watched, I was suddenly aware that I was crying. I began to sob, not in controlled, disciplined tears, but full body heaves. I wept, and the church burned. It felt like watching a friend die in real time. So I began the strangest day of my life. I continued to sob uncontrollably, yet I desperately needed to work. An inbox full of press requests and a congregation in crisis would not permit what I yearned for, to wrap myself in a blanket and cry until dehydration. So I cried as I wrote media statements. I cried while we organized a vigil. I cried over my keyboard and into my phone. In the occasional quiet moment, I cried with my coworkers because the church still smoldered and there was nothing we could do to resurrect its body. When you're sobbing, it feels like the world should stop on its axis and the sun should freeze in the sky. Raw grief grips us by the shoulders, yet there is small mercy in tasks that need to be completed. Labor can offer mild distraction, but as anyone who has busied themselves organizing a funeral knows, this does not buy escape from pain. It just puts sorrow on layaway. I woke the following Friday, and I realized in mild panic that there was nothing more to do. After a stretch of 12-hour workdays, a day off loomed ahead, terrifying in its expanse. I made a pot of coffee, but forgot to pour a cup. By the time it finished brewing, my lacrimal glands had supplanted my frontal cortex, firmly in control. I began, in the mountain goat's words, to walk the house like a little boy lost in the mall, until the walls themselves felt threatening. I fled, in vain hope that my anguish might stay home behind me. We had recently moved to Maine, and I still didn't know anyone, but I also couldn't handle another minute alone. My partner, Erin, was back in New York visiting family, and there's only so much crying we can do by ourselves before we begin to feel slightly mad. So I drove to town and wandered into a store. And there I was immediately reminded of another reason why we cry. It connects us to community, even when we don't yet have one. The owner, Ariel, greeted me as I walked in. She asked me how I was doing, and all my polite lies collapsed around me. Actually, pretty bad, I admitted. I started to cry softly. She offered me a beer. So there we sat at 11 a.m. on a Friday morning in an empty boutique, Modelo in hand. I told her why I loved Middle Church so deeply, how it was a safe haven for queer people, the first place so many folks heard that God loved them exactly as they are. I spoke of the love that echoed in stone walls, exuberant hugs and gospel hymns that reverberated in the sanctuary long after the choir left. Ariel tenderly listened to my grief, and then after I had told her the story, her reply was as blunt as it was compassionate. Wow, that fucking sucks. For days, I had sat through well-intentioned people telling me, it's okay, the church isn't a building, the church is a people. While I know that's theologically true, when you're crying amid the ashes of an immolated church, those words feel less like a kindness than a reminder of all you've lost. Ariel didn't try to fix that grief. She didn't offer paltry condolences. Instead, she named the calamity. Crying is a conduit that tethers our soul to another. It circumvents our intellectual processing of someone else's pain. We are hardwired to respond to crying. It's at the very core of who we are.
No, it's beautiful. You gave us a taste of the audiobook too, I was just realizing. So tell us, so you recorded the audiobook yourself?
I did. It'll be. I didn't realize that like it takes 10 days for them to like listen to it and approve it. So I was like all jazzed. I had it done on Saturday, and I was like, it's gonna be in the store by the time the launch happens. And I like hit submit, and it was like, we'll be back to you in 10 days. And I was like, all right, well, guess not.
That's okay. So where will that be available? Audible?
Audible and yeah, Amazon and all the
Libby?
places.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. And what I was wondering about this too. What link would you prefer that we share when we share your book for selling?
I always am a big fan of just going to your local bookstore and asking them to order a copy. That both tells them that the book is in the world and, makes it more likely that they'll stock it in the store. And also, I'm just a big fan of supporting local bookstores. I have a whole bunch of events up in Maine. If you're in Maine out there, I'm coming to your local bookstore. But yeah, no, I mean, the reason I selected that reading is I think it embodies so many of the different facets of crying, like both like the personal self-soothing parts, but also just this deep social connection that crying elicits. I mean, it's this beautiful, deeply human thing that when we see somebody weeping, and we start to cry in response, we're actually taking some of their pain into our own bodies. We're not just saying, "Oh yes, I feel your pain." Like we're actually feeling some of their pain. That's just this beautiful, beautiful thing. I wanted to bring up a story actually from your book. You tell a story about this racist skating rink manager who wouldn't let you and your siblings skate because you were wearing turbans. And your mom cries and cries profusely when all the other parents in the in the group of kids who you were out with decided to protest and have none of the kids skate there and go do something else for the day. um, it's just a really striking and beautiful story, but I was wondering if you could just sort of reflect on what it was like to see your mom crying like that and see it in the context of a communal response.
Yeah, it's interesting because this is a story that um, I thought about a lot as a kid as I was growing up. The incident at the roller skating rink happened when I was in fourth grade, so pretty young. And over the years, as I share in the book, it's something that really shaped my own view on how to deal with difficult situations writ large. And so I say that to say it's a story that I reflected on quite a bit over the years.
Yeah.
And one of the aspects of that story that's remained consistent in my memory is that um, the the strangeness of seeing my mom cry for the first time. So I'm about 10 years old, and I hadn't seen her in that way before. She was when my parents came as immigrants. Life it wasn't hard. I mean, it wasn't easy, but it was tough and
Yeah.
and gritty, and they had to figure out how to make it work. And so I'd always seen her as tough, and in situations like this she always just handled it. um and so the story as I've told it and as I remember it is, um I go over to my mom and she's crying, and my like it's almost this like feeling of I don't know how to react, and so I just start crying too. And I wasn't much of a crier as a kid. um and and so that part of it feels really memorable. And the strange thing about that experience for me too was I'm crying because I think it's unfair and we should be able to skate. My mom's crying because she feels gratitude um and is grateful that the other parents and teachers have agreed to walk out. And so that part of it I think is really striking. And I was thinking about the same story as I was reading your book, which is so often we associate crying with some negative experience. But I think especially over the years I've started to understand that for me at least, it's any moment of overwhelm, like when it feels like uh, I don't know how to say it. I mean, you say it way more beautifully in the book than I am now, but it's almost like this, like your body is trying to process something that it hasn't encountered before, and in
Yeah.
that moment. And sometimes it's empathy, and sometimes it's pain, and sometimes it's joy, or whatever it is. But like it is far more variegated as a range of emotions than I would have realized, and your book kind of helped open that up for me too.
It's interesting. This guy Ad Vingerhoats, who is like the crying guy. If you look at all into the crying research, he's like he's the dude. He's done like all of the psychological research. If you like look at all, like just glance at the crying research, you'll see his name popping up over and over and over again. And one of the findings that he's found is that feelings of powerlessness are one of the most common reasons why people cry. And it's
Mm,
interesting in that story because there's both a simultaneous powerlessness in the sense that you don't get what you wanted, which was to go and skate because this guy, this manager wearing a clip-on name tag didn't let you, and he holds the power in that very limited sense. And yet at the same time, you're claiming that vulnerability becomes a source of power.
yeah.
And I think that that's this really beautiful tension where so often we cry because we don't know what to do. We feel powerless. We don't know. And yet in that act of crying, it so often reveals this source of power that all of us carry within us, which is this ability to be tender in the world. And there's so much power of daring to be grateful, of daring to trust in community, of daring to be tender and let ourselves feel enough that we risk a real encounter with the world. It doesn't always turn out great, but so often it does.
Mm,
And it's that antidote to that punishing isolation that I think so many people experience right now, that sense of powerlessness in the face of systems that are so large and so unimaginably destructive that we don't know what to do about them. That act of crying forges a connection with our neighbors. It can, build a collective response of parents who decide we're going to leave this skating rink rather than, you know, uh, acquiesce to injustice. And it creates this wellspring of hope and gratitude inside of us. It's just what a beautiful, multifaceted response to what we experience in the world.
yeah. Yeah. Wow. You said it so beautifully. And I think part of what really stands out about your book, and you sort of just like demonstrated this is, um, there's so much depth and complexity to this very instinctive human experience. I mean, one of the chapters you open with describing how the first thing we do as babies is cry, and then over time,
A lot.
yeah, and we unlearn that, and part of what I found really fascinating about this book and what you just shared is, um, it's not just the practice or the habit or even the ritual of crying that we've erased from our culture, at least tried to. Um, it's it's also the experience of it and all that it entails, and by oversimplifying it, and almost, criminalizing it in a way, it has put us in a position to not even know what we're missing out on. And like I think so many of the best teachers, and I saw this in your book too at work, so many of the best teachers are able to help uncover some of those experiences through beautiful storytelling. And I think there's so many good stories, that open up space for understanding, throughout your book. So yeah, kudos on that as well. The storytelling in here is really powerful.
That's the only way we really change. I mean, that's something that I fervently believe. I don't think facts actually change much of anything in the world. They're important. I'm not, being anti-intellectual in any sense or stretch of the imagination. They're crucial. I love learning new things, but actually, story is the vehicle that changes how we see somebody else, that changes our relationship with another person, that alters the heuristics or the ways that we, and so sometimes that's, personal story, first person story of, an experience you have with somebody. But if we don't have, that opportunity, the very next best thing is, being able to tell rich and nuanced and compassionate stories. And that's what, one of the things I really tried to do in the book is not do away with that nuance, because I think crying in particular, it can be easy to talk about in simplified ways because we treat it simply. Crying for a very long, there are not very many books on crying, because we have not seriously treated crying as a topic worthy of formal consideration. I think that that's partly because it's effeminized, and we don't treat most things that are feminized as worthy of serious consideration. Um, but we write it off in all sorts of different ways, and we don't actually treat it, certainly within any kind of academic corpus or social criticism, as a topic worthy of serious engagement. We also don't treat it in our own bodies like that too. People have asked me, what do you hope from this book? Do you want people to cry more? And like, sure, yeah, like.
Oh, that was my next question. You just took my next question.
I stole from you. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I don't. If people end up crying more because they read my book, awesome, love that. I think that's great. What I really want people to do is I want to invite them into curiosity about their own bodies, and to use crying as a vehicle to explore some of the social forces that affect our embodiment. I use crying as sort of my doorway to talk about that. But I think tears refract all of these different systems that work on our emotional lives. And so that's what I really tried to bring out, is to help give people a little bit of a field guide of some different things that they might not have considered about, all the forces that shaped them, ones that they may be well aware of and ones they may not have thought about as much. Because I think when we can actually approach our own bodies with that kind of place of curiosity, that's what helps to unravel some of that shame that I was talking about earlier, shame we have around our bodies, around our sexuality, our gender. And it also helps to humanize other people. Kelly Brown Douglas, this incredible theologian. For folks who don't know her, you should go read all of her books because she's just an absolutely brilliant person. But in my interview with her, she talks about the dismissal of Black crying in a social context, because to recognize and truly treat Black tears in the fullness and completeness of their emotional depth is to recognize Black humanity. And our country does not want to do that. And so we reject, Black grief as a simulacra of real emotion, that we don't treat it as though it was, real grief the way that white grief would be. A Black mother cries in a courtroom and it's not treated, Sabrina Fulton crying over Trayvon Martin is not treated the same way that a grieving white mother would be treated, because we don't see her grief as real in the same sense, because we won't refuse to see her humanity as real in the same sense. And I think that, if we can enter into that place of curiosity about our own tears, it also helps us to then enter into that place of curiosity about other people's tears and about other people's, full emotional lives. And I think that's one of the real keys to starting to, uproot this deep alienation that has taken root in our country.
So in a way, are you suggesting that crying can help solve some of our deep challenges, whether they're personal and spiritual or social and political?
Yeah, and the last chapter of the book, because in the beginning, I'm doing all this work and I'm building it up and I'm talking about how important crying is and the ways that it changed my own life and why. And then I get into all these social forces and I'm like, oh, they don't want you to cry because crying is so powerful. And then I get to this last chapter, I'm like, this is the big so what payoff chapter, and I make a confession and I say, so if we all start crying, are all these systems going to be different? Are they all going to be, we're going to end racism? Of course not. Of course we're not. Like that's not crying is not a silver bullet. If everybody starts crying more, it's not going to magically fix all the things that are wrong. But I think it'll help. And sometimes a source of genuine help is what we need in order to, open that door towards transformation. Crying, I think what it can do is open a door. It's up to us to walk through it. But crying can create the circumstances for change.
Okay, before we wrap, tell us a little bit about what's coming up next for you. You have a tour, you have some events, you getting
there's a big launch at the Housing Works bookstore in Soho tomorrow night. If you're in New York, I think there's still a couple seats left for that. I'm going to be with the comedian Sam Ruddy. We're going to do a whole laughter and tears kind of thing. Sam is fabulous. They've been on Colbert and The Tonight Show and a whole bunch of other places. I'm just like bringing in my coolest friends. I'm like, I'm not super funny, but Sam is. So I'm really, really excited to have that conversation with them. It's going to be a really lovely, opportunity to dig in. There's a, like a catch bar and stuff. So it'll be sort of a lively event. Then this Sunday, I'm going to be at Middle Church and talking about crying after worship then. So that's, the worship is at 11:45. It's in the East Village, East End Temple. If you go on middlechurch.org, you can see the information about that. But there'll be a book talk back after that. And then I go up to Maine where, the reach of some of these events in Maine, the ability for people to participate drops off precipitously. But if you find yourself in mid-coast Maine, I'm going to be doing a cool event with actually the store owner who I talk about in that first chapter. She wants to do a event, so like the little bookstore doesn't have enough space to really have a full reading and reception, and so she offered her boutique as a location, and so we're going to do a conversation with her, which I think is really, really fun.
That's
So I'm
great.
looking forward to that, and some like little churches and other places. So yeah, and if if you're out there and you have a reading group, or you have a a church group, or a discussion group, whatever group of friends who want to read the book and want me to come and talk, I'm usually pretty down to come talk about crying. I love it very, very deeply, and I'm always happy to come and chat with y'all.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much, Simran. Again, this is my book. It's out now anywhere books are sold, but also Simran's book is The Light We Give, and it's really, really fabulous. Go out and buy both of them.
I'm blurring my background so I can show my book too.
Look at that.
Yeah.
Love that.
If you're really lucky and Ben really likes you. Oh no, is this my, I didn't bring, I have two copies and I have a signed copy. This is not it. Nope, not my signed copy. But yeah, if you're really lucky, Ben, ask him for a signature too.
I will 100% sign up for you. And I'm going to post in this chat while we're still here. This is the link to this Zoom room. So if you want to come over to the side with the little squares, I would love to come and say hi. But thank you so much for spending time listening to Simran and I talk about my book. If you go out and buy it, please send me a note, drop me a line, let me know what you think. I'm so excited to hear what the book, how it sits with your spirit. It's just an overwhelming delight and joy for it to be in the world. So thank you for coming and spending some time.
Congratulations. Big day, big week. Awesome book. Yeah, really excited for you. So congrats. Hope you have some time to, the hard part's over now. It's just fun. So just enjoy it.